Sega history is beyond intriguing to revisit. Some of you will remember the Sega Saturn, that ambitious, misunderstood console that marked the beginning of the end for Sega's hardware reign. But what if I told you that there was another machine being developed around the same time, one that could have changed everything? A console whispered about in old magazines, glimpsed in blurry prototype photos, and debated for decades. A console that existed somewhere between dream and reality, conceived in corporate boardrooms but never reaching living rooms. A machine that promised to unite two worlds of gaming before vanishing without a trace. Today we're diving into one of Sega's most elusive secrets, a console so rare, many question if it ever truly existed at all. I am Lady Arcade, and if you're fascinated by gaming history, especially strange and forgotten hardware, then hit subscribe, as today we're taking a look at one of Sega's most mysterious lost consoles, the elusive Sega Neptune. The Sega Neptune was meant to be the console that fixed everything, a single streamlined box to unite the Mega Drive and the 32X and finally untangle the mess of peripherals that had left players confused and developers exhausted. It was supposed to be simple, affordable and sleek, Sega's way of proving it still understood clarity in an era defined by chaos, but instead it became the ultimate symbol of that chaos, a console that existed yet somehow never really did. Announced, photographed, even previewed in magazines, only to vanish before reaching store shelves, because sometimes the most fascinating consoles in gaming history aren't the ones that lived, but the ones that died before they were even born. So let's go back to where this story begins. By 1994, Sega wasn't collapsing, not yet, but the cracks were starting to show. Just a few years earlier, the Mega Drive had made Sega the coolest name in gaming. Sonic the Hedgehog was everywhere, arcade conversions like Golden Axe and Outrun were flying off shelves, and Sega of America's attitude-driven marketing had made the company a genuine cultural force. But beneath the surface, that success was already splintering. In Japan, Sega's top brass were obsessed with the future, the dawn of 32-bit gaming, while in America, executives wanted to keep milking the Mega Drive for all it was worth. The result was a corporate tug-of-war that would create one of the most confusing hardware strategies in gaming history. The panic really began in January of 1994 at the Winter CES in Las Vegas. Sega president Hayao Nakayama phoned Joe Miller, head of Sega of America's R&D division, in response to Atari's flashy new 64-bit Jaguar grabbing all of the headlines. With the Saturn still a year away, Sega needed something, anything, to hold the line. Nakayama's first instinct was to go big, an all-new 32-bit cartridge console codenamed Project Jupiter, but Joe Miller wasn't convinced. As he later told Sega 16, if all you're going to do is enhance a system, make it an add-on. If it's a new system with legitimate new software, great, but if the only thing it does is double the colours... And so Project Mars was born, the device we'd come to know as the Sega 32X. It was pitched as a cheap stopgap between the Mega Drive and the upcoming Saturn, giving players a taste of next-gen power without forcing them to buy an entirely new console. On paper, it seemed like a clever compromise, but in practice, it was a catastrophe. When the 32X finally launched that November, it needed its own power brick, its own video cables, and even its own expansion links. A mess of wires that gaming magazines gleefully mocked as a wiring nightmare. Players expecting a simple plug-in upgrade found themselves elbow-deep in ports and adapters, trying to make sense of Sega's spaghetti of hardware. The result was chaos on a monumental scale. The 32X wasn't seen by most as an evolution, but as a failed appendage. A confusing half-step that splintered Sega's audience and left developers unsure which platform to back. By 1994, the Mega Drive had sold over 30 million units worldwide, and its fan base was still strong. Why alienate them with another new machine so soon? The 32X was meant to simplify gaming, yet it turned setup into an ordeal. So after its release, the divide in Sega grew deeper. The American division saw the 32X as a temporary fix to keep players engaged until the Saturn was ready, and the Japanese division meanwhile viewed it as a pointless distraction that undercut their flagship console. And when the Saturn finally launched in Japan in November of 1994, Sega found itself in the bizarre position of competing against itself. For a company once defined by confidence and clarity, Sega had become a maze of mixed messages and bad timing. And it was in the middle of this confusion that the idea of the Sega Neptune emerged, a single streamlined console designed to bring order to the chaos. One plug, one system, one message. By early 1995, Sega could no longer pretend that things were fine. The 32X was a catastrophe, retailers were slashing prices just to shift stock, developers were abandoning projects mid-production, and players were left staring at a mess of cables, wondering what on earth they'd actually bought. Sega needed to regain control of the narrative fast. It needed one product that could cut through the noise and remind the world that it still knew what it was doing. And so, the Sega Neptune was born. For a brief, fleeting moment, it looked like the perfect solution. A single all-in-one console that would merge the Mega Drive and 32X into one sleek package. One plug, one power supply, one price. Next Generation magazine first broke the story in its February 1995 issue, reporting, codenamed Neptune, a planet slightly smaller and, if Next Generation's astronomical experts are to be trusted, next in line to Saturn. A combined Genesis 32X unit is planned for release later in 1995. The article added that Neptune will incorporate 32X's twin Hitachi 32-bit chips and retail for a Jaguar challenging $200, positioning it as an affordable mid-range system with the muscle to compete. Other reports place the price even lower at around $149.99, which Sega Magazine framed as proof of the company's renewed commitment to hardware and affordability. The plan seemed clear. Sega wanted to merge the Mega Drive and 32X into one coherent machine, a sort of last-ditch attempt to untangle the mess of its own making. In theory, it was exactly what the company needed. When the Neptune made its public debut at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show that year, it actually looked the part. The prototype was a sleek black console, like a futuristic evolution of the Mega Drive Model 2, with smoother lines, a compact form factor, and the 32X hardware neatly built into the motherboard. For the first time in years, Sega looked like it had a plan. At the same event, Sega confirmed that the Neptune would retain full compatibility with the Mega CD, thanks to a side expansion port identical to earlier Mega Drive models. In theory, that meant one thing: this single console could do it all. After years of add-ons and adapters, it finally felt like Sega had finally found a slightly more elegant solution. The gaming press took notice. Next Generation magazine described the Neptune as proof of Sega's determination to stay in the hardware game, while the internal company materials hailed it as Sega's first truly unified console platform. To loyal fans who had endured the Mega CD and 32X debacle, the Neptune sounded like the long overdue reset and finally a chance for Sega to present a coherent vision for the future. And visually it looked the part. Sleek, minimalist, but unmistakably Sega. The cartridge slot was redesigned to accept both Mega Drive and 32X titles natively, a clean and practical solution to years of hardware chaos. But as history would show, by the time the Neptune was ready, the rest of the gaming world had already moved on. For all its messy origins, the Sega Neptune was, on paper, an impressive piece of hardware. Just like the 32X, it would have carried the same dual Hitachi SH2 32-bit processors, the very same architecture that powered the Saturn, only clocked slightly lower at 23 MHz. Working alongside the Motorola 68000 CPU from the Mega Drive for backwards compatibility, the Neptune was effectively two generations of Sega technology fused into one sleek unit. It would have been able to display more than 32,000 colours on screen, deliver smooth sprite scaling and rotation, and even handle basic 3D rendering, a remarkable achievement for something built atop 16-bit foundations. At first glance, Sega's plan for the Neptune seemed genuinely clever. By merging the Mega Drive and 32X into a single, affordable package, Sega could offer players a low-cost entry point into 32-bit gaming, a way to experience the next generation without paying next-gen prices. To some, it sounded like a bargain. Buying a Mega Drive and 32X separately would have cost more than $300 when new, so a single machine that did both for half the price looked like a masterstroke, a simple consumer-friendly solution to years of hardware nonsense. But unfortunately, logical thinking alone couldn't save a company already hemorrhaging money. After all, during this time frame, Sega wasn't fighting Nintendo anymore, it was up against an entirely new generation. Sony's PlayStation had just launched in North America at $299, instantly redefining what next-gen meant, while Sega's own Saturn stumbled onto shelves at a bruising $399 after its chaotic surprise release. Priced at around $150, the Neptune would have sat on the market awkwardly, too expensive to be a true budget console, and nowhere near powerful enough to stand beside the 3D heavyweights from Sony and, ironically, Sega itself. It would have essentially been a machine caught between worlds. Some of the numbers might have made sense on a spreadsheet, but in practice, the Neptune could have potentially been commercial suicide. At this time, Sega was already begging consumers to embrace the Saturn. It was supposed to be their official next-generation console, and the last thing they really needed was another product muddying the message. As one commentator later joked, by the time Sega could explain what the Neptune actually was, most customers had already walked out of a PlayStation. So in the end, the Neptune would not have been just cheap, it would have been confusingly cheap. A mid-tier machine built to fix yesterday's problems, launching into a market that had already moved on. Sega had essentially thought up the perfect console for a battle it already lost ages ago. By mid-1995, the writing was on the wall. The 32X flopped, the Saturn had stumbled out of the gate, and Sega's once golden reputation was in freefall. Even inside the company, optimism had curdled into exhaustion. Scott Bayless, one of the key figures behind Sega of America's hardware strategy, later summed up the era with brutal precision. We stormed the hill, and when we got to the top, we realised it was the wrong damn hill. That single line captured everything wrong with Sega in the mid-90s. It wasn't just battling competitors, it was battling itself. On one side stood Sega of Japan, led by Hayao Nakayama, who was determined to make the Saturn the company's one true next-generation platform. On the other hand was Sega of America, led by Tom Kalinske, who still believed the 32X and, by extension, the Neptune could buy the company precious time. The Americans wanted to cater to millions of loyal Mega Drive owners unwilling to leap to a $399 Saturn, while the Japanese saw those same customers as a distraction from the future. And the result was paralysis. Sega split its limited resources between two incompatible systems, one already obsolete and the other too expensive to gain traction. Developers didn't know which platform to back, retailers didn't know what to stock, and consumers had no idea what to buy. Meanwhile, Sony's PlayStation was flying off the shelves. In that climate, the Neptune never stood a chance. Officially cancelled in October of 1995, just months before its planned release, Sega cited market consolidation as the reason. The truth was simpler. The company simply couldn't afford to design, produce and market yet another console that would directly compete with its own. Inside Sega, resignation set in. Commentators later described the Neptune's cancellation as the final admission that Sega's multi-system experiment had imploded. Even Tom Kalinske, once the champion of a unified hardware strategy, left the company before the year's end, worn down by the endless internal politics and power struggles. And perhaps the most poetic twist of all? Its name. By the time Sega cancelled the Neptune, it had become symbolic, a smaller planet forever overshadowed by its larger neighbour, Saturn. What was meant to bring unity instead became the final emblem of a company at war with itself. One that, in trying to conquer two worlds, ultimately lost both. For a console that never reached store shelves, the Sega Neptune has somehow achieved near mythical status, the ghost of an alternate timeline where Sega finally got it right. And unlike most gaming legends, the Neptune wasn't just a rumour, it was real, a console, one you could have held in your hands. Today, the only known official Sega Neptune prototype shell resides at the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas. It's a striking piece of hardware, unmistakably Sega, yet sleeker than any of its predecessors. It looks like a Mega Drive that evolved, streamlined and ready for a world that never came. Unfortunately, the museum's unit isn't a functioning console, it's a mock-up shell designed for trade shows and photography rather than gameplay, but it is a physical piece of history nonetheless. Its origins, like much of Sega's mid-90s history, are hazy. The prototype is widely believed to have come from Clint Dyer, a former Sega employee who worked at the company between 1993 and 1996. Dyer's name appears frequently in Neptune folklore. Some say he acquired the shell during the final days of the project, while others believe it was passed through internal channels as Sega quietly abandoned the design. Either way, his connection has made him a folk figure among collectors. But where Sega left off, the fans picked up. In the decades since its cancellation, enthusiasts and engineers have done what Sega never did. They've made the Neptune work. One of the most impressive efforts came from Ko-Sam, a hardware modder who created a custom single-board PCB merging the original Mega Drive and 32X chipsets into one cohesive unit. His build doesn't just play like a Neptune, it is one, built from genuine Sega components and updated for modern displays and power standards. Then there's the DV-IZIX, which went a step further by producing high-quality 3D printed Neptune shells. These reproductions faithfully mimic Sega's original casing and can be ordered through PCBWay, allowing collectors to assemble their own working Neptunes for roughly $360 or more if they chase perfect authenticity. Most recently, the Brazilian firm GamesCare announced the GF1 Neptune, an ambitious FPGA-based recreation scheduled for release in December 2025. This modern reinterpretation includes HDMI output, SD card support, Wi-Fi connectivity, and even a digital storefront for indie Mega Drive titles, proof that somehow the Neptune story still isn't over. And that's what makes the Neptune so fascinating. It never had a launch day, no sales charts, no official legacy, and yet it refuses to die. It lives on through the passion of hobbyists, historians, and hardware tinkerers who looked at Sega's greatest what if and decided that wasn't enough. Essentially, where Sega saw a dead end, the community saw unfinished business. In the grand saga of Sega's rise and fall, the Neptune stands as more than just an unfinished console. It's the final casualty of a company that could never stop tripping over its own ambition. Its cancellation in late 1995 marked a turning point, Sega's complete pivot towards the Saturn. The system Japan believed would restore the company's glory, but that gamble proved devastating. The Saturn, rushed and fragmented at launch, quickly lost ground to Sony's sleeker, cheaper PlayStation. In trying to unify its strategy, Sega had done the opposite, abandoning a budget-friendly system that might have kept its 16-bit audience engaged, in favour of a high-end console that failed to win over the new generation. The story only grew more tragic from there. When the Dreamcast arrived a few years later, it carried every lesson Sega had learned: simplicity, innovation, developer-friendly design, but by then, the damage was irreversible. The wounds left by the 32X, the Neptune, and the Saturn had shattered consumer confidence. Commentators later argued that the Dreamcast wasn't destroyed by the PlayStation 2, but by the ghosts of Sega's past decisions. And in that haunting lineage, the Neptune sits right in the middle, the moment where everything could have changed but didn't. Looking back now, the Neptune feels like the great reset button Sega never pressed, a chance to unify its sprawling ecosystem before the market slipped away. But instead, it was sacrificed in favour of a strategy that only deepened the divide. From the Neptune to the Saturn to the Dreamcast, Sega's downfall wasn't the result of one bad console, but of a pattern: brilliant ideas undermined by corporate chaos. The Neptune represents that moment right before the fall, the calm before the company's identity imploded. A sleek black box that could have simplified everything, yet ended up symbolising nothing but what might have been. Through this lens, the Sega Neptune wasn't a failure, it was a casualty, the last gasp of a company torn between innovation and identity. It promised simplicity, but was born from chaos, and in trying to unite two worlds, it drowned between them. It was supposed to be Sega's redemption story, but instead it became a monument to indecision. It stands today as a cautionary tale about fragmentation and timing. It exists not as a product, but as a possibility, a what-if frozen in time. Now, the Neptune lives on through museum exhibits, fan recreations, and the imaginations of collectors who see in it something pure. Sega's final attempt to make sense of itself. It's a reminder that sometimes even the most forward-thinking ideas don't die because they were wrong, but because they arrived at the wrong moment. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Sega's greatest what if, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and help this new channel grow. It's finding its feet in the algorithm, and every like, comment and share genuinely helps me bring you more stories from gaming's forgotten past. So tell me in the comments, do you think the Neptune could have worked if Sega had released it? Or was it always destined to become yet another ghost in the company's long line of missed opportunities? Thanks for watching, and if you want more gaming history tales, why not check out my upload on the Sega Saturn.